The world's least densely populated place is Gorilla City. Being non-existent, it has a population of 0. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. It has a population over 17 million, but area-wise is quite small. Dhaka has a population density of 47,400 people per square kilometre, higher than any other city in the world. And as more people flock to the city each year, things will only get worse. But it wasn't always like this. Dhaka has only held this position for 3 years. For a long time, the most densely populated location on Earth was a place that doesn't even exist anymore. It was a tiny settlement built upon an abandoned Chinese fort, yet was called home by tens of thousands. For most of its history, she was stuck in a state of legal limbo, leaving it without laws. And inside this lawless bubble, an entire society emerged, and eventually died. This is the story of Kowloon Walled City. The origins of this story are far-reaching and obscure. In the early 1800s, a small fort was built in what would soon be known as Hong Kong. At the time, European empires were encroaching on the East like never before, carving up Asia amongst themselves. With valuable coastal territory and a unique allure, China was worried she might be next. It turns out she was right to worry. Trade links between Europe and China had been established for hundreds of years, but European merchants could only access China through one highly controlled port called Canton. This resulted in a trade deficit that favoured China. From a British perspective, the situation was what in those days they would have called bloody unacceptable. Long story short, they went to war with China. By the end of it, China agreed to open 5 port cities to European merchants and cede Hong Kong to Britain. The loss of Hong Kong didn't seem like much. It was a small and almost uninhabited island, a truly insignificant place. But as a British territory, Hong Kong would be rapidly transformed. It was one of 6 gateways to China, attracting merchants and bankers from across the globe. In the blink of an eye, Hong Kong was an important centre for trade. You could have called it the Foochow of China, but that would be ridiculous because Foochow is in China. But there was a problem. Inside Kowloon was the small fort I mentioned earlier, and for some reason China was determined to keep it. They insisted that despite it being surrounded by what was now British territory, it remained Chinese. It seemed like both sides wanted to own this worthless little fort, and for decades it was unclear who did. But then in 1898, Britain wanted to expand their Hong Kong territory again. China wouldn't agree to this unless the deal made it clear they owned the fort. Eventually that deal was complete, meaning China officially owned the fort. Yet this solution only made things more difficult. From this moment, Hong Kong would have no authority within the fort, and Chinese authorities were unable to reach it, as British land surrounded it. That is how the fort became a lawless never zone. But this was just the beginning of the story. Over the years, the neglected fort fell apart, with no authority to maintain it. Criminals on the run would find refuge there, knowing local police could not enter. By 1947, 2,000 people called it home, which didn't exactly make it a city, but the population would soon explode. When Chairman Mao and the Red Army won the Chinese Civil War, masses of people fled China in fear of the new regime. Most went to Taiwan, where a new country was founded, but some went to the fort. In a matter of years, more than 20,000 called the area home, and it came to look more like a settlement than a fort. Still, with no government or police or escafy, criminal gangs took control of the area. They established brothels and opium dens, attracting more and more people. In the 1960s, the area came to be known as Kowloon Walled City, and it's easy to see why. Despite being just 390 feet, hundreds of buildings now housed 30,000 people. An entire society sprang up within the walled city. It was crime-ridden and rat-infested, and looked a bit like a neighborhood from Blade Runner. But it was a society, with streets and schools and hospitals and taverns, every kind of establishment imaginable. The city was especially known for dentists, unlicensed dentists. You didn't know if they were real dentists or not, but at least they were cheap. At its peak, there were 700 businesses and almost 9,000 homes, which sounds like a lot, but the population was 33,000 at the time. That means the population density was 1.2 million people per square kilometer. At the beginning of this video, I said Dhaka was our world's most dense city, with 47,000 people per square kilometer. 47,000 to 1.2 million. Because they couldn't build outside the boundaries of what was the old fort, they had to build homes on top of homes and streets on top of streets. This resulted in a 14-story tall slum, compacted together like nothing else ever has been. I mean, it's basically mental. A tiny lawless never zone where 33,000 people lived under the radar, as if in a parallel universe. A hidden world ruled by gangsters and populated largely by drug addicts and prostitutes. The Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Bloodsport is about a martial arts tournament so brutal it can only be held in the city, as in the outside it would be illegal. But in real life, most in the city were not criminals or drug dealers, or even Belgian martial artists. They were just people who called it home. Many were born there, others came for the low rent fees. The city even had its own postman. He was one of the only people able to navigate its complex of narrow streets. By the mid-1970s, the walled city was so notorious for being a triad haven that Hong Kong police started raiding it. They found 4,000 pounds of illegal drugs, and in coming decades the reputation of Kowloon Walled City didn't improve. In 1985, the British and Chinese governments agreed that Hong Kong would become part of China in the year 1997. And so in that year, Hong Kong became a Chinese territory once more. 10 years before that, the two governments agreed that Kowloon Walled City should be destroyed. So in 1992 it was demolished. Because of course it was. I'm surprised it even lasted so long. Residents were evicted, some of which forcibly, because apparently they didn't want to leave the worst place in the world outside of Alabama. After the eviction, $350 million was distributed among former residents. The site of Kowloon Walled City is now a historical park, with elements of the old city on display. It stands as a monument to what was our world's most densely populated place. The park features a large model of the city, and you might be struck by its appearance. It was like a post-apocalyptic human beehive, and if not for a legal technicality, it would have been even larger. Because of an airport right next to the city, there was an airspace limit on how tall it was able to grow. If this was not the case, maybe it would have kept growing. Just like Kowloon Walled City, the airport in question was pretty dangerous. It was shut down soon after. So that brings us to the end of this video. I know you guys want me to upload more often, but they really take a long time. I want to make sure these videos are edited just right. In the meantime, if you want more content from me, follow me on Instagram @Escafy Media.